8 years after their first bout, two living legends were set to face off in the ring one more time. Their first encounter was a true rarity in boxing. Two top fighters meeting in their prime to put everything on the line. The fight had been absolutely epic, more than living up to expectations. At first, Leonard had tried to use his complex footwork to outbox Hearns from long range, moving outside to stay well away from Hearns' terrifying chopping right. But in the years before Hearns developed the insane power that would earn him the nickname Hitman, he had been a wiry kid who relied on his nuanced lead hand and graceful footwork to dance circles around his competitors. And so, Hearns had outboxed Leonard, beating him at his own game. Leonard had in turn been forced to play the role of aggressor. And mid-fight, he wobbled Hearns with a thudding uppercut through his guard. Hearns survived the round and recovered, slowly taking back control of the fight and chipping away at Leonard to expand on an already comfortable lead with each passing round. That is, until Leonard's coach, the great Angelo Dundee, set him straight in the corner. Ray decided to attack with everything he had. He made peace with the possibility of getting knocked out, abandoned his fancy head movement and footwork, stood right in front of Hearns, lined up his shot, and threw a picture-perfect 1-2. Ray threw a torrent of unanswered punches, sending Hearns to the canvas twice, but Hearns somehow survived. He had dominated the rest of the fight, and knew that if he could hold on just 2 more rounds to the finish, the bout would be his. But although Hearns gave all he had, Leonard was relentless. The ref stopped the fight. Leonard took the championship belt, and Hearns was left to live with the reality that victory had slipped through his grasp at the last possible moment. This loss, his first, was particularly hard on Hearns. He would later describe the memory as a monster that constantly followed him everywhere he went, ever present even as he racked up accolades and titles in multiple divisions. Now, 8 years later, he would finally have a chance to kill that monster, avenging his first loss once and for all. Sugar Ray had a different reason to want to revisit one of the iconic fights from his prime. Like Hearns, Ray was beginning to show his age. Although both fighters were still among the very best, they no longer seemed invincible. Sadly, a good deal of Leonard's performance could most likely be attributed to personal problems. Problems that he was only now just beginning to work his way through. Fittingly, he would begin to face his deepest fears the same time he prepared to face the only man he had ever been afraid of. After months of intense training, the night came. As the two fighters faced off in the center of the ring, Ray realized that one thing had not changed. He was still terrified of Thomas Hearns. But soon after the bell announced the beginning of the bout, it became abundantly clear that Leonard was not looking to repeat the mistakes he had made during their first encounter. Rather than box from the outside, Ray was looking to set up power shots right away. However, he still had to be wary of Hearns' own immense power. So, he set up his attacks by sinking low, entering the pocket off of body shots and feints, before exploding upwards to levy bombs at Hearns' head. The style of fighting that Leonard had chosen to use against Hearns was essentially an old-school pressure style, made to load power and evade punches by entering in low. Hearns wasn't looking to repeat his mistakes either, and kept Ray far away by framing off of his head and intercepting his entries with jabs and long lead hooks. When Ray did manage to work his way inside, Hearns' masterful head movement kept him well out of harm's way. Leonard was hitting nothing but air. To quote the man himself, "My eyes were filled with fear instead of confidence. The plan was to attack Tommy with a steady diet of overhand rights, yet every overhand right I threw was off target. There was no snap in my jabs, and the left hooks felt like lead." To make matters worse for Leonard, as the rounds progressed, Hearns started building off of his jab, adding on stinging lead hooks, rear straights, and overhands. It was now abundantly clear that neither man was looking to box. Each would be trying their hardest to knock the other out. In this vein, Leonard knew it was only a matter of time before Hearns showcased his legendary chopping right. As it turned out, Hearns would showcase his signature punch in the third. With a minute left in the round, both men threw simultaneous crosses. Hearns moved his head far offline, barely slipping Leonard's haymaker, but Hearns' tighter punch slammed into Leonard as he came in, proving once again the age-old adage that boxing is a game of inches. Leonard tried to play it off, but he was stunned, and Hearns wasn't fooled. The hitman went after his target. Leonard went into a defensive crouch, but tracking head movement was what Hearns' chopping right was built for. It hammered down on top of Leonard's skull, slamming him to the canvas. Hearns stood triumphant. After all these years, he had finally put Leonard on the ground. But Leonard took the shot well, standing right away for the count. Still, a lesser fighter may have let himself get beaten right there. Leonard could have taken the early knockdown as yet more evidence that he was fading, but as he had proved countless times before, he was made of tougher stuff. As he himself put it, after the first knockdown, too many fighters panic, which leads to a mistake in the next, often conclusive, knockdown. The key is to slow down your heart rate and survive the round. Although Ray stayed defensive, he did not let Hearns bully him. He picked the right moments to show calculated aggression and let Hearns know that he was still a threat and far from beaten. When the bell sounded, Ray walked off as if he had won the round. Coming out for the fourth, both fighters still showed a willingness to take risks. They blended tempered offense with responsible defense, each having their moments. The two seemed evenly matched as ever, as if the knockdown in the third had never happened. But by the fifth, Hearns was again finding his mark with far more consistency. That is, until Leonard stepped in deep with an overhand that grazed Hearns' cheek, and then caught him with a hard left hook as he tried to pivot away. Hearns' head whipped around, and he crashed into the ropes. It was a sudden and shocking reversal. This was the same sequence that had given Hearns so much trouble their first fight, and had a lot to do with the angle from which Leonard set up his hooks. Leonard was squaring himself up to Hearns by stepping deep into his attacks, his feet nearly lined up with Hearns. When Hearns tried to pivot away to regain a less exposed, more narrow position, Leonard did not follow suit. Rather than try to regain his stance like Hearns, Leonard simply turned as he threw. This is the same tactic that was used by Mike Tyson to dominate the heavyweight division for years, and that Leonard had used to catch Hearns during their first encounter. Hearns was hurt badly, and Leonard came in to finish the kill, but now it was his turn to show how to stay calm under pressure. Lack of clinching ability had cost Hearns dearly when Leonard had rocked him during their first fight. When Hearns had tried to clinch, he used double collar ties from a distance, leaving both of Leonard's hands free and giving him the space he needed to flurry. But Hearns had learned his lesson, and now he tied Leonard up when he could, and picked his shots well when he couldn't. "I was holding him like he was my woman," Tommy would later admit. Hearns withstood Leonard's flurries, taking moderate damage but nothing close to fight ending, save for when he lost a dual exchange of hooks by dropping his rear hand. Leonard thumped him in the chest after the bell, showing respect. As Hearns sat down, his coach, the great Emmanuel Stewart, praised him for his ability to hang on, shouting, "That is what makes a great champion." After all these years, it had to be deeply disheartening for Hearns to be caught by the same shot that had cost him in their previous fight, but also a huge relief to know that he could now defend himself and stave off Leonard's punches if he needed to. Still, it goes without saying, he must have adamantly hoped that he would not need to showcase those skills again. Hearns seemed to have recovered by the time the bell rang for the sixth. In contrast, Leonard seemed sluggish, having punched himself out trying to put the hitman away. But Hearns was still wisely cautious, and stayed at long range, where he could pick away at Leonard with his lengthy jab. He used a signature trick, swinging his lead arm in time like a scythe to get his rhythm, so that he could then break that rhythm to shoot out lightning fast, whipping jabs. Ray started to taunt Hearns, hoping he would lose his cool as Duran had so many years ago. But the hitman remained steady, and Leonard was forced to once again try to work his way inside. He had little success until the last 30 seconds of the round, when he landed the same hook that had damaged Hearns so greatly before. But this time, rather than pivot out, Hearns stepped back into southpaw to absorb the blow, and then stepped back into orthodox to counter with a left hook of his own. Hearns had stumbled onto this angle through intuition, but it remained to be seen if he could evade Leonard's aggression with consistency. Near the start of the seventh, Hearns paid Leonard back for the hard hook he'd taken in the fifth. Double jabbing to bring out Leonard's hands, Hearns arced his hook past Leonard's long forearm block, something always a risk when using an extended guard. Leonard, clearly shaken, was now in major trouble for the second time. Hearns drove him back and bullied him against the ropes. Even though he smelled blood in the water, Hearns stayed calm and picked his shots well, alternating high and low punches and timing Leonard's head movement. He even tied Leonard up to take a breather after concluding his 30-punch barrage. Somehow, Leonard once again endured, and after a brief lull in the action as both fighters caught their breath, the two stood in the center of the ring and traded shots. It was Leonard who came out slightly better, taking the steam out of Hearns with brutal blows to the body. As the two fighters walked back to their corners, it was beginning to dawn on those watching that this may well become one of the greatest bouts of all time. Both fighters idolized Muhammad Ali, and each man brought different elements of Ali's style to the ring. They were different enough to make the tactical back and forth interesting, while still similar enough to keep the fight frustratingly even. The momentum seemed to change nearly every 2 rounds, and it was anyone's guess what would happen next. The 8th round would have much of the same feel as the last half of the 7th, being fairly even until Hearns caught Leonard near the tail end with a huge overhand, set up off of a short jab that blocked Leonard's vision for just long enough. Leonard seemed fine, that is, until Hearns landed one more tight cross. Leonard had a slightly delayed reaction, stumbling back, but the ref seemed to mistake it for a slip, giving Leonard the time he needed to get his feet back under him. As the round came to a close, Hearns tried to use a collar tie to pull Ray into an uppercut, but Ray had fought Duran and easily got out of Hearns' trap. Understandably upset, Ray snuck in 2 shots after the bell. Hearns could only smile. The grappling trick aside, Sugar Ray also had to be frustrated by how the fight was slipping out of his hands. Aside from the 5th, when Hearns hadn't been completely dominating rounds, he'd been making a good argument to take them on points. Now well past the halfway mark, Leonard would have to do something to even the score, and soon. In the 9th, he did just that. At first, the round was uneventful. It remained painfully evident just how evenly matched both competitors were after all these years, with the two even throwing simultaneous crosses and meeting in the middle, like 2 fighters locking blades in a dramatically choreographed sword fight. Leonard continued to work the body with some success, and the hitman continued to snipe at Leonard's head. Just as it seemed that Hearns may yet again be building up to a knockout, Sugar Ray once again turned the tide of the fight. Hearns had been successfully defending against Leonard's overhand hook combination during the last several rounds, mostly by ducking underneath rather than trying to pivot out. But this time, Leonard had changed his setup, entering into the exchange with an uppercut rather than an overhand. These uppercuts had first made an appearance in the previous round, and while they had worked to set up a few tight, cuffing shots, they hadn't set up anything substantial until now. Although Leonard only grazed Hearns, it was enough to convince the hitman to straighten up, setting up Leonard's devastating hook. Once again, Hearns was saved by his hard-learned ability to clinch, and thankfully for him, this time the bell was not far away. As the bell rang for the 10th, Sugar Ray looked to start where he had left off, charging in with a wild overhand. Although he missed that one, it didn't take long for Leonard to again find his mark, unloading a beautiful 4-shot combination. Jab, rear body hook, lead body hook, and a tremendous lead hook to the head. This was the first time in the fight where one man had managed to capitalize on the work he'd done the previous round. Leonard was taking a lot more risks now, fighting much more like a brawler than the fleet-footed fencer he was known for being. He got in close to smother Hearns, throwing tight, whipping, tearing combinations. Leonard hoped to use his superior speed at close range to negate Hearns' power from the outside, and so far, it was working. Hearns was gradually wearing down, his ability to move around the ring slowly leaving him. His legs were lead, and his arms were drooping. With just 11 seconds left in the round, Leonard once again caught the hitman the same sequence that had brought him success so many times before. The shot hit just behind the ear, and Hearns' legs almost gave out. Leonard had now dominated 2 rounds in a row, the first time this had happened for either man. Hearns knew from experience what would happen if he allowed Leonard to build on his success over multiple rounds. He would have to halt Leonard's momentum now, or face the all-too-familiar consequences. In the 11th, Leonard again charged out, perhaps hoping to invoke bad memories of Hearns' iconic war against Marvelous Marvin Hagler. He dug deep and tried to overwhelm Hearns with sheer force of will. But Hearns had learned his lesson against Hagler, who would not be lured into a firefight, but neither would he give up on taking the fight by resigning himself to a purely defensive attitude. He instead set up a nuanced trap, leaving out his jab and gliding it down to push against Leonard's rear shoulder. This not only unbalanced Leonard, who had already had his weight on his back foot from pulling Hearns' jab, but also exposed Ray's side, turning him directly into Hearns' chopping right. Leonard managed to take away some of the sting by rolling with the punch, but only some. Leonard was stunned, and Hearns easily countered his jab with another hard right. One was enough for most, and it's nothing short of astonishing that Leonard was still standing. But the hitman had his target square in his sights. He threw himself into a terrifying lead hook, but Hearns had overcommitted and found himself out of position to follow up. However, in a beautiful display of agility, Hearns sidestepped out to change angles, using his footwork to load even more power into his cross. Even Sugar Ray Leonard couldn't take that punch. The whole sequence was highly reminiscent of Rocky Marciano's iconic knockdown of Ezzard Charles. The ref began to count. 1, 2, 3. But incredibly, Leonard once again rose from the count, ready to continue. And not only was he alright, he came out swinging. And what's more, he actually had enough left in him to seriously hurt Hearns, once more coming out the winner in a battle of hooks. Throughout all of his rounds with Leonard, Hearns' rear side defense was proving to be his greatest weakness. Hearns got his feet under him and fired back, unloading shot after shot on Leonard. But Sugar Ray was relentless, shrugging off the punches of one of the hardest hitters in the history of combat sports for the chance of landing a late knockout. As the round came to a close, Leonard landed the big overhand that he'd been looking for all night. But Hearns took it well, and it was little compensation for all of the punishment that Leonard had taken to get it. Walking back to his corner, Leonard knew that the fight had slipped out of his hands. There was only one way left to win. He would have to knock Hearns unconscious, no matter the risk, and no matter what it cost him. Hearns was just as determined to not let that happen. He knew how close he was to taking the fight, and avenging the loss that had dogged him for the last 8 years. Now it was his turn to charge out and bombard Leonard with every punch in the book, pulling him into hard, short uppercuts. While Hearns had underrated boxing skills, Leonard definitely had an underrated chin. But for Hearns' fast start, it soon became evident that he may not have had the energy to spend. Now it was Leonard's turn. Showing what champions are made of, Leonard began to walk down the man who had just put him on the canvas twice, perhaps the only man in the world that he truly feared. He was dead, Hearns would later recount. But you know what? He came back. I didn't think he had such a great heart. Leonard's punches started to get through the guard of his arm-weary competitor. And as he began to build steam, Hearns realized that he was once again in jeopardy of losing a hard-won battle which he had been dominating until the very last second. Hearns had a clear victory unless Leonard could put him down right then, in this round. As more and more punches penetrated Hearns' guard to slam into his face and ribs, that possibility was beginning to look like a certainty. All of Hearns' hard work, all of the questions that had been following him around for 8 years, that monster that he could never outrun, all came down to this one last round. Hearns used every defensive trick that he knew, but as the clock ticked down to the end of the fight, the truth was that it was sheer force of will that was keeping him on his feet. With only 1 minute left, the ref was eyeing Hearns, considering stopping the fight. 10 seconds later, Hearns tried to use his head movement, but was forced to shell up when Leonard drove him into a wide hook. With 40 seconds left, Hearns tried to smother Leonard, but took a hard uppercut through his guard for his efforts. 30 seconds, Hearns was trying anything he could think of, using a long block and cross guard like a Muay Thai fighter, and then shelling up to push Leonard away. He took another hard hook to the jaw for his trouble, but still, he was standing. 20 seconds left, Hearns fought back with the last of his energy. Leonard easily evaded and countered Hearns' arm-weary attempts at aggression, but then, Hearns finally hit home, not with his chopping right, but with the foundation of his entire style, the jab. 2 hard jabs forced Leonard into a defensive position, and finally gave Hearns a chance to clinch. Leonard hit Hearns with a hard hook on the break, wasting himself valuable seconds as the ref issued a warning. Now there was only 11 seconds left, but still Leonard would not relent, throwing out a straight right. Hearns slipped it, countered with a body hook, and tied up Leonard again. 8 seconds left. Ray hurled one last overhook. Hearns ducked and weaved under, once more tying Leonard up until the bell rang for the last time. Hearns had survived. After one of the most nail-biting, edge-of-your-seat, back-and-forth fights ever fought between two all-time greats, the crowd could not help but roar their appreciation. The fight was in the judges' hands now, but Leonard knew that he had lost. In the champion's own words, the only uncertainty left was the margin of defeat. I braced myself for the announcement. But then the scores were read, and the victor was both. The fight was ruled a draw. The judges must have been watching a different fight, Leonard would later relate. Perhaps Leonard wasn't giving himself enough credit. If the fight had clearly been going Hearns' way, it had still been competitive. And as always, what truly mattered wasn't the scorecards of 3 men who'd been taking notes at a nearby table. What mattered was what the 2 gladiators who had stepped into the ring that night had left inside the squared circle, and what they had taken back from it. Tommy took the loss in stride. In his mind, he had won, and finally killed that monster that had dogged his every step. Leonard had shown that he still had what it took to be great, that with focus and discipline, he could face down his fears. Over the next few years, he would continue to do this inside and outside of the ring, slaying his own personal demons. Just as they had 8 years prior, the two had made each other stronger, each immortalizing the other in the annals of boxing history, and showing the world that legends can never truly die. And if this kind of high-level strategy being utilized during dangerous situations is something that intrigues you, then I recommend you check out our new graphic novel, Mortal Weapons, written by myself and illustrated by the great Iman Rashid. It comes in at a hefty 100 pages with an 8x11 page size, and is full of real-life strategies and techniques. And best of all, if you pre-order right now, you can purchase Mortal Weapons for only $6.99. From the Modern Martial Artist, this has been David Christian, wishing you happy training.